You know, I've written special music for each holiday. This sort of gives me a chance to keep a little promise I made to myself. I said I was going to sing this song at the end tonight.
I'm dreaming of a white Christmas, just like the ones I used to know.
That's obviously White Christmas by the great Bing Crosby. One day I'm going to do a segment on Bing Crosby. But I want to talk a little bit about the ideas that are communicated by White Christmas. That's the film Holiday Inn, where it got its start. Crosby has sung it on one of his radio programs, but that's where it became popular. It sold 50 million copies. It remains the world's best-selling single in terms of physical media, with Crosby's other versions, it has sold 100 million altogether. When Irving Berlin wrote it, obviously one of the greatest of the great songwriters, when he wrote it, he was at a hotel in California where there was no snow, and it begins with a lyric about how it's a perfect day. You've never seen such a day in Beverly Hills, L.A., but I'm dreaming of a white Christmas. And he said to his secretary, I want you to take down a song I wrote over the weekend. Not only is it the best song I ever wrote, it's the best song anybody ever wrote, and a lot of people agreed with him. And people often talk about what's so appealing about this song, why this song above all others to be the best-selling single. And one of the things everybody talks about is the melancholy of it, the nostalgia, the White Christmas, just like the ones I used to know, this kind of yearning for something in the past. And I can't help but wonder, by the way, if some of this Irving Berlin was Jewish, and if some of the tone of it comes from an outsider wistfully looking at this beautiful holiday and making it his own, because it was one of the first secular Christmas carols ever to become as popular as it was. But also, of course, it was written in 1942, when a lot of guys were overseas and missing home and feeling that yearning for home. And according to Crosby's nephew, Howard Crosby, he says, I once asked Uncle Bing about the most difficult thing he ever had to do during his entertainment career. And he said in December 1944, he was in a USO show with Bob Hope and the Andrews Sisters, and they did an outdoor show in northern France, and he had to stand there and sing White Christmas with 100,000 GIs in tears without breaking down himself. And of course, right after that, they all went to the Battle of the Bulge, where many of those boys never got to see home again. And during the war, this kind of song became very popular. Have yourself a merry little Christmas. Next year is an olden days, happy golden days of yore. Faithful friends who are dear to us will be near to us once more. Yearning again for something that was in the past. I'll be home for Christmas, if only in my dreams. And a lot of nostalgia, that yearning for home. But the interesting thing is that a white Christmas, the fact of a snowy Christmas, also has its origins in nostalgia. Charles Dickens, who's sometimes called, I think there's even a movie about Dickens called The Man Who Invented Christmas, he is said to have brought Christmas back into fashion in the Victorian era, because after the Industrial Revolution, broke up families, it broke up traditions, it moved people out of the country into the cities, it took children and women into workplaces where they hadn't been before, and it diluted traditions. And Dickens tried to bring some of those back and to remind people of what they were back. And when he started writing his famous Christmas stories, obviously including A Christmas Carol, he was already hearkening back to an older time. There was already an atmosphere of nostalgia to it. And there was a lot of snow in his stories, whereas in England in late December, you don't really see a lot of snow, especially in London, where a lot of his stories take place. You almost never see snow. But interestingly, for the first 8 years of Dickens' life, there was a huge cold snap. It was climate change. I'm sure there were Democrats running around complaining about it, but there was a huge cold snap. At one point, the River Thames froze over and people were skating on it. And there was a white Christmas every year for the first 8 years of Dickens's life. And when Dickens was 12 years old, his father was sent to debtor's prison. His father was a spendthrift, and he was sent to debtor's prison that broke up the family. And Dickens, who was his father's wife, his mother, and the little children went into debtor's prison with the father, which was the tradition at the time. But Dickens had to go to work in a factory pasting labels on pots of bootblacking. And this was a really, really traumatic experience. It appears in his books throughout, the children being made to work, the how bad debtor's prison is, and Mr. Micawber and David Copperfield is the spendthrift, kind of based on his father, whose famous phrase is an annual income of £20 and an annual expenditure of 19 pounds 19 and 6 results happiness. Annual income 20 pounds, annual expenditure 20 pounds, 0 and 6 result misery. In other words, if you live within your means, you'll have a happy life. So it's not too far off to speculate that those snowy Christmases that show up in Dickens harken back to his idyllic childhood before the trauma of his father's arrest, before the trauma of his father being in prison. Those white Christmases were the ones he used to know when things were going well. And it's interesting that now, because Dickens sort of did invent our modern notion of Christmas, we associate Victorian England with Christmas. When you send a Christmas card, it might have a Bible scene on it, it might have a modern scene, but oftentimes when it'll have a scene of England or a scene of men in top hats and women in Victorian dress. And so we now think of Christmas as associating it with that part of the past. We're nostalgia for that part of the past. But here is the joke. Even in Victorian England, the people in the olden days were hearkening back to the olden days. Like I said, the Industrial Revolution had broken up a lot of their customs and they were thinking backward. And their Christmas carols were written to sound old. There is a wonderful article, I read it about 10 years ago, by Joseph Bottom, who's the editor of the wonderful magazine First Thing, the other one with Claremont Review, that and City Journal, and First Things are the magazines I get. And he wrote an article called Here We Come A-Wassailing, and he starts out by quoting some carols. He says, "Little Lord Jesus, no crying he makes, and what the gladsome tidings be, and we three kings of Orient are, to say nothing of, if thou know'st it, telling." He says, have you ever noticed just how weird the grammar and syntax of Christmas carols are? Or I guess I should say, the songs of Christmas notice thou, the strangeness filled with are and how. And he points out that even the title of God Rest Ye Merry Gentlemen is misunderstood. It's not God Rest Ye, Merry Gentlemen. Rest means keep. This means keep merry, stay merry, gentlemen. So it's God rest ye merry, gentlemen. And Bottom says, you know, there are all these odd phrases there, like the witch's mother Mary did nothing taken scorn, which you'd think would make you say, like, was his mother a witch? That carol is actually old. It dates to the 17th century, but most of the other Victorian carols are written to sound more old-fashioned than they are. So this brings up a really interesting question, which is, why is Christmas a nostalgic holiday? Why does it come with that sense of loss and yearning to be as we were before? And it's interesting to note that the word nostalgia is an invention of the late 18th century. It was coined in the late 18th century as a medical term by a Swiss physician named Johannes Hofer, who was trying to tell what Swiss mercenaries felt when they were in the service of other monarchs, when they were far away from home. They suffered from a morbid homesickness, a morbid yearning for home, which he called nostalgia. So that white Christmas idea, I'll be home for Christmas if only in my dreams, is almost the definition of nostalgia, that yearning for home. And it's interesting that nostalgia, both personal and societal, is something we all feel all the time. Even people who have had bad childhoods think back that there was a moment in their childhood that was not bad. There was something they lost in their childhood. And even people in a society that's going well, always, there is never a time when people don't think that the golden age of a society was in the past. People are always saying, oh, the golden days. Now we think about the 1950s. And obviously there are good times and bad times for a country. As I say, I think this is a very unhealthy, a very sick time for our country. But the idea that before now everything was serene and everything was fine. This is a country that has always been roiling and tumultuous and revolutionary. And people have always been saying, you know, George Washington was accused of wanting to be king, the man who basically pulled liberty out of the ground and gave it a local habitation and a name. But, you know, when we talk about the greatest generation, they went through Depression, they went through World War. What makes them the greatest generation is the hardships they faced, which are make ours look like nothing. So when we yearn to live in the past, you know, it's a little bit fake. Like I always think, like I'd love to live in 18th century, early 19th century England, right around the Napoleonic Wars, if I could have penicillin with me, because otherwise you get a cold and that's it. So we're always yearning for something in the past. This is a steady state. And why is this? Why is that steady state of nostalgia associated with Christmas more than any other holiday? There's a famous painting by a Belgian surrealist named René Magritte. You've probably seen it. It's a picture of a pipe. And it has a caption in French. Magritte was French. It says, Ceci, no, I'm sorry, he was Belgian. It says, Ceci n'est pas une pipe, right? This is not a pipe. So the picture of a pipe, and this is not a pipe. And the picture is called The Treachery of Images. And his point is being that this is not a pipe. It is a representation of a pipe. And I think really, I've talked about this a lot, but I think the entire world is like that. It is the work of God, his creation. So like a work of art, it is a representation of something else. It is a representation of God's kingdom and God's nature and God's mind, because we create out of our mind and out of our heart. So this world that we live in, this is not a world. This is a representation of something deeper. And that deep thing is what I think we are all looking for. We are looking for the thing behind the thing. I think this is true of all our desires for sex, our desire for love, our desire for fame, our desire for money, I think are all yearnings to get in touch with God, to be at one with the mind of creation. C.S. Lewis called this yearning joy. He said, joy is always a desire for something long ago or further away or still about to be. It is never there in the moment. It is always a longing for something far away. He says, if I find in myself desires which nothing in this world can satisfy, the only logical explanation is that I was made for another world. And it's that other world that this world is just a broken, faulty representation of. That memoir that he wrote that in is called Surprised by Joy. And Surprised by Joy is taken from a poem by William Wordsworth. And William Wordsworth wrote one of the greatest, possibly the greatest poems on this subject about the past and what it means to people. It's a poem called Intimations of Immortality from Recollections of Early Childhood. And he talks about how when he was young, and this is what defines Wordsworth, is he felt at one with nature. He felt at one with nature. He had a visionary feeling about it. And now that visionary feeling, as he gets older, is starting to pass away. And he says, whither is fled the visionary gleam? Where is it now, the glory and the dream? And this is his conclusion about what's happened to him. He says, our birth is but a sleep and a forgetting. The soul that rises with us, our life's star, hath had elsewhere its setting and cometh from afar. Not in entire forgetfulness and not in utter nakedness, but trailing clouds of glory do we come from God, who is our home. And so what he's saying, if you get that image that our birth is a sleep and a forgetting, what we sleep is where we come from. And the star that rises, our life star, sets somewhere else and comes from somewhere else. And we don't come utterly naked, we come with a memory of that. We come trailing the glory up from God, who is our home. That poem, which is written in the early 19th century, and the word nostalgia, which is invented in the late 18th century, are hearkening back to something that I think people felt had been lost in the Middle Ages, a unity with the spiritual fact of nature, a greater comfort with the fact that nature is a creation and nature is a representation of a world beyond nature. And I think that in Jesus' birth, what we see is that nature, us, the pinnacle of that nature, which is humanity, and God coming together in the birth of Jesus Christ. And it is a memory that we have that this is right, this is true, this is telling us something that we already know. You already know we are coming from God, who is our home, and our nostalgia is the yearning for that home. And so nostalgia and Christmas go together because we are yearning for something we have yet to see, but in the birth of Christ, we realize we will see it someday. If you love this great content, and why wouldn't you love this great content, like us and subscribe to The Andrew Klavan Show to wallow in Klavan-y goodness.